Okay, let's go ahead and start. So thank you everybody for joining us. We are delighted to have the BC Utilities Commission join us for this webinar. We've heard from a number of our members that they would like to open up, especially in light of starting the Integrated Resource Plan review, that they'd like to have an understanding of the regulatory process that will be undertaken, that's already kicked off. And so we've invited the BC Utilities Commission to come and share an overview with us, and we will also have an opportunity to provide some Q&A. So just in terms of how we're going to set this up, we are going to have a presentation that will last probably for about the first 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have some room there for Q&A, and then we'll have a second presentation, and again we'll have an opportunity for Q&A. So if you have questions, put them into the Q&A box, and we'll be moderating that, and we'll be able to put those questions to our guests. So I'll introduce our guests. First of all, we have Patrick Ruck, who is the Commission Secretary for the BC Utilities Commission and the Manager of Regulatory Services. So Patrick started with the Commission in 2012 and was appointed Commission Secretary and Manager of Regulatory Services in 2016. He has the statutory responsibilities of the Commission Secretary position, which is to maintain the BCUC's official proceeding records. Patrick also assists the public and interested parties to engage in Commission processes, often as the first point of contact for those needing assistance. And we know that. Secondly, we have Nicola Simon, who is the Executive Director for Facilities and Planning. So she is going to be the project manager on the BC Hydro IRP proceeding. Nicola has over 25 years of international experience in project management, engineering, and operations, starting in the UK. She moved to Canada working for Ballard Power Systems and Fortis BC in senior management positions before joining the Commission in 2017. Nicola currently provides strategic planning and direction for the organization and manages all infrastructure and resource planning applications, as well as various regulatory matters at the Commission. And then finally, we have Phil Stallard, who is the Manager of Facilities and Planning. Phil joined the Utilities Commission in 2017. He manages utility applications related to resource planning, demand-side management, and consultation. Prior to joining the BCUC, he worked for the UK-based transportation body, Rail Delivery Group, which represents the UK's largest electricity consumer. So I would like to introduce, first of all, Patrick. He is going to share his screen to share a presentation with us. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you so much, Lorene, and thanks everyone for coming today. So if you just bear with me here, I'll get the screen sharing. All right, there we go. So I'll get jump right in here into our agenda. So I'm going to start off the presentation and talk a little bit about who the BCUC is, what the BCUC does, and generally how our processes look. And then I'll pass it over to Phil, and he'll talk about integrated resource plans and BC Hydro's integrated resource plan. And so what Lorene mentioned at the beginning there, we'll kind of pause at that just before the integrated resource plan in case there's any questions about the BCUC. We can deal with those, and then we'll get into that topic, and then finally have questions after that as well. And then one little sort of disclaimer I just wanted to raise at the beginning is that we are BCUC staff presenting today. So We're not the commissioners, we're not the decision makers. And given that the IRP is a live proceeding, we won't be able to talk about the content or the actual application itself, but we can certainly talk about the process and what's been set out so far. So the BCUC is an independent regulatory agency of the provincial government, and we primarily are governed by the Utilities Commission Act. We also are subject to lots of other legislation enacted by the province, such as the Clean Energy Act, the Administrative Tribunals Act, the BC Hydro and Power Authority Act, and Freedom of Information legislation as well. And we make legally binding decisions about the matters that come before us. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, we're comprised of staff and commissioners. And so the commissioners are appointed by the Lieutenant Governor and Council, and those are the decision makers that make the decisions on the applications that we receive. And the staff are comprised of different professions, engineers, accountants, economists that support the commissioners in their decision-making process. And when we hear an application, we usually have a panel of 1 to 3 commissioners, and they're the ones that review the applications filed by those that we regulate. And I'll get more into that shortly. So this slide just gives you a quick overview of some history of the BCUC, starting back in 1938 with the Public Utilities Act. And the commission that exists today, the BC Utilities Commission, was created in 1980. And over the years, the commission or the various organizations regulated different things, things in the past, such as milk, cemeteries, railways. And now we're really focused on the public utility sector, the natural gas and electric utilities in the province. Also ICBC, the Insurance Corporation. And then most recently, we were named the administrator of the Fuel Price Transparency Act. And that has expanded our mandate as well. So this is our mission. It's to, it's really important for the BCUC to treat utilities fairly and ensure that they have a reasonable opportunity to earn a fair return on their capital while balancing the needs and interests of customers. And this is our vision: to be a trusted and respected regulator that contributes to the well-being and long-term interests of British Columbia. And finally, our values: accessibility, integrity, responsiveness, innovation, and excellence. All right, so I'll move on to sort of the bread and butter of what the commission does, what the type of work that we undertake. As I briefly mentioned, our primary work is around public energy utilities and regulating those companies. We also regulate ICBC's compulsory automobile insurance, so that's just the basic insurance. We don't have jurisdiction over the optional side of their business. We also oversee the mandatory reliability standards by adopting appropriate standards and supervising compliance of those entities. As I mentioned, the Fuel Price Transparency Act, we were recently named the administrator under that act, and we are collecting and publishing information on our website, which is gaspricesbc.ca, that reports on gasoline and diesel activities in BC. We review complaints about the actions of regulated entities, so anyone that's impacted by a public utility is free to submit a complaint to the Utilities Commission, and we will assist in reviewing that. There is something called the Customer Choice Program in BC, where gas marketers sell natural gas through FortisBC at a fixed rate over usually a 5-year term. So we license those gas marketers, and then we also deal with any disputes or complaints with respect to those contracts. We establish tolls and conditions of service for common carriers, purchasers, and processors, so pipeline companies. And then lastly, something that's not on this slide, we also do review other matters that government will refer to us. So for example, they'll ask us to undertake an inquiry, and we will undertake that work as directed by government. So this just shows you some examples of the main utilities that we do regulate. So the electric utilities, the big ones are BC Hydro, and FortisBC has a small electric utility in the interior. There are also other electric utilities in the province, such as the City of New Westminster, Penticton, Summerland. Those are municipal utilities, and we don't have jurisdiction over those electric utilities. And then as far as natural gas is concerned, Fortis BC and PNG, Pacific Northern Gas, are the main natural gas distribution companies in the province. So this slide gives you a little overview of what we're trying to get into the topic of what is regulation and what does regulating public utilities look like. So we look at rate applications. We look at what's called a certificate of public convenience and necessity. So we're approving construction and operations of facilities. We look at energy supply contracts, and then generally we have jurisdiction to oversee and supervise the actions of public utilities that are under our jurisdiction. So the reason or the rationale for energy regulation, why do we need it? It's really comes down to the fact that it's a monopoly. So the customer has limited or no choice in who they can choose to be their electricity or natural gas provider. So that's why we need energy regulation. And the rationale for economic regulation, again, it's all about protecting the customer from the abuse of monopoly power. So excessive pricing and predatory pricing are some examples of monopoly power. And the role of regulation and regulators, it does vary from different jurisdictions, but generally speaking, the regulatory compact is the principle that we operate under. And the point here is that a utility needs to provide safe and reliable service, and also be able to earn a fair return on the capital that they invest into their companies. So with that overview of who the BCUC is and why we regulate, I'll now get into our process. And what does our process look like? So we make legally binding decisions that are based on the evidence. So it's important to note that when the commission makes a decision, it has to be based on the evidence that's submitted in that proceeding. Procedural fairness is very important. So making sure that all the parties have access to the information. So all of our proceedings are generally public, and all of the information related to those matters are available on our website. And it's also important to us to have input from the public and other parties that are going to be impacted by the decisions that we make. And then, of course, we have to operate under the Utilities Commission Act and ensure that we're following that legislation. So this on the right-hand side gives you a little overview of sort of a high-level overview of what a standard hearing looks like. So the commission gathers evidence through various different ways. So we may have interveners submitting information. We will ask information requests to build out the evidentiary record, and then the sort of the final phase of the proceeding after the evidentiary phase concludes is final argument, where everyone has an opportunity to make their final arguments, and then the applicant has the opportunity to give a reply. And then the panel of commissioners will deliberate and make their final decision. So how do you get involved? So I'll spend a few minutes on this slide. So there really are three main ways to get involved. So becoming an intervener, and or writing a letter of comment, and registering as an interested party. So when one makes an application to become an intervener, they're going to be actively participating in the process. And the real a major purpose of an intervener is to help the panel to see different perspectives, and help the panel also build out that evidentiary record so that they have the information they need in order to make a well-reasoned decision. So interveners often are groups. So Clean Energy BC, I think, is an organization that will be intervening in the proceeding, and it will represent its members. So that's, we really like it when organizations that represent a group, if they can group together and then they're represented as one intervener rather than having a number of different interveners that all represent the same interest. There can be a lot of duplication in the process. So we try and get those that have similar interests to group together. And again, intervening in a proceeding is being an active participant and participating from the beginning to the end of the process. And so a more passive way to participate is to simply write a letter of comment where any member of the public can share their views about a matter that's before us, and they can write out a letter and we will add that to the public evidentiary record, and it'll be considered by the commissioners throughout the proceeding as an interested party, which really means that you receive email notifications every time a document is filed in the proceeding, and you do also, your name will also be added to the public record. So my next slide is about the appeal process. So after the commission makes a decision, it is subject to appeal. So there are two ways to appeal a decision, and one is by submitting a reconsideration application, and then the other is through the Court of Appeal. So the first one is submitted to the BCUC, and the BCUC will hear the application for reconsideration and then make a decision on it. And then the second process is through the Court of Appeal. So every decision that the BCUC makes is subject to appeal in the Court of Appeal. And usually what will happen is a party will need to exhaust all other resources. So they'll have to make a reconsideration application prior to the court providing leave to appeal. So it's important to note that you will likely have to undertake both processes. So with that ends my portion of the presentation. So I will maybe pause there in case there are any questions. And then if not, we will move into a few slides about what an integrated resource plan is, and then a little bit about BC Hydro's integrated resource plan.
That's great. Thank you, Patrick. So are there any questions? I don't see any in the Q&A box.
Okay, well, no worries. If not, I know the most exciting topic is the one that's coming up, so we can dive right in, and I'll pass it on to Phil.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks, Laureen. So, yeah, as Patrick said, I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview of what integrated resource plans are all about. Unfortunately, can't get too much into the details, as was mentioned, of what's specifically in BC Hydro's integrated resource plan, because we're kind of off and running on the proceeding on that, but can certainly talk in a general sense, and if there are any specific questions, we'll see what we can do to address those. So just talking about what an integrated resource plan is all about, this is something that looks at the long-term view of the utility's future, and considering at the highest level, it's that what is its expected demands for the customers, and what's it going to need, what resources is it going to need to supply those customers looking into the future. So just putting a little bit more meat on the bones there, like this, an integrated resource plan is sort of typically compiled of a number of different components that sort of set the scene for this overriding task, let's call it. So we tend to begin with a planning context, which can consider things like important policy developments, customer trends, different things that are going on in markets that are relevant to the utility, other different exogenous factors that may be affecting either their customers' demand or the availability of different resources that may be available to the utility, or indeed the direction of travel that that governments are setting at federal, provincial, municipal levels that are going to affect what decisions the utility is going to be having to make in the short, medium and long term. Having considered some of these, the utilities will typically set out what their overall objectives for the resource plan are. So typical things may include addressing costs for customers, ensuring reliable supply, reducing carbon emissions that's coming from energy supply. It may involve reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, like these kind of things that are kind of things which the plan itself needs to achieve and work towards. So then getting into the actual plan itself is that a utility will put forward typically a range of demand forecasts for both their energy requirements and capacity at their peak or their forecasted peak. As I say, this is typically a range, recognizing that the future is uncertain, that any line that you draw on a graph is going to be subject to change and subject to a number of different factors which will actually drive what the future might look like. So there may be, sort of some bookends that we'll look at. These are the reasonable forecasted range of supply that we would expect over a long period. Then the utility will look at the resources that they have at their disposal for which they can use to serve that demand. So that will include a consideration of demand side measures, so things that are focused on energy efficiency. It may also be measures that are on the demand side that reduce the need for peak demand, so like capacity focused ones. And then on the supply side, it's a consideration of all of the existing and future resources that may be available to the utility. So that will be a consideration of both the utility's physical assets, their generation assets, their transmission assets, but also a consideration of energy or capacity that they may procure from other parties, so from independent power producers, or from, let's call it the market, quote unquote, thinking about cross-border trades. Having then considered the different attributes, availability, different risks that all of these different resources may have, the utility then puts together a range of resource portfolios, considering that sort of the different levels of demand that they may need to meet, and putting those all together to thinking about whatever their objectives were that they set out at the start of the plan, saying, from this pool of supply and demand resources that we can draw from, what is the optimal way that we can serve our forecasted demand in future? How might that need to change if our demand works out higher or lower than we perhaps had in our reference or most likely case? And considering how that portfolio is set up to adapt and address different risks or uncertainties that may transpire in the future. And then putting that all together, the final piece of an integrated resource plan would be the action plan, which is kind of looking at the shorter term. So in the next 1 to 4 or 5 years, what are the specific things that the utility is actually going to have to do to start enacting and fulfilling the sort of longer term vision that is put forward before us. So next slide, please, Patrick. So that kind of talked about the content of a resource plan. And this slide here, I just wanted to sort of explain where this fits in with the BCUC's world. I've put a few quotes on the screen there that I'm not going to read them all out, but these are drawn from some BCUC decisions on past resource plans for different utilities that we regulate, and just kind of talking about like what is the purpose in terms of fitting into that bigger regulatory picture that Patrick kind of introduced earlier. So I think the key thing to highlight here is that a resource plan is it's like a high level planning tool that it kind of sets the vision and context for what issues that the utility is going to have to be facing in the future, and in a matter that fits in with their own strategy and also provincial considerations that they're going to have to fulfill. but it's separate from approval processes that are related to specific projects or programs that the utility is actually going to perhaps either build, contract, spend money on, etc. And this is the case in most instances. We do not approve any specific projects or programs within the IRP. What we are looking at is whether the utilities plan is in the public interest, having considered a number of different factors. That is the direction of travel that the utility has set out here one that is reasonable in considering the public interest. Now, where that actually goes in terms of some of the more tangible actions or applications that the utility puts forward. And sorry, I've put in an acronym there. There's probably a bunch in this slide that I didn't have a chance to explain out, but the BCUC's jurisdiction largely comes from a piece of legislation that's called the Utilities Commission Act. For those that aren't familiar, that's what the UCA is. And this sets out the different considerations for various different utility applications that come before us around the specific things that the BCUC has to consider in making its decision. And the most recent resource plan that is filed by a utility then goes into, let's say, other utility applications or proceedings that would be before the BCUC, and is a factor that the BCUC explicitly has to consider in making those decisions. So just briefly explaining the ones that I've highlighted there, expenditure schedules, which may be requests for money to spend on different capital activities, also related to potentially involving demand side management activities that the BCUC would have to consider what was said in the most recent resource plan. Certificates of public convenience and necessity, Patrick briefly mentioned. This is kind of thinking about extensions to the utilities' overall infrastructure. So that could be generation assets, transmission assets, distribution assets. It could be greenfield, could be brownfield. But basically extending the utilities' capabilities to supply its customers. And also a consideration in energy supply contracts, so electricity purchase agreements with independent power producers as an example of that. And that the information that is in the resource plan kind of serves as a building blocks for all of the different all of those different applications mentioned there, and that the information in a resource plan, presuming that it is done in a manner that the BCUC found to be acceptable, should also help to promote greater efficiency and consistency when we're looking at actual requests for projects, programs, money that the utility is needing approval for, and hopefully bringing it under an umbrella of greater consistency, and that ties these sort of distinct projects or programs into that longer term vision. So next slide. And just wanted to then highlight the regulatory process that is currently established for the review of BC Hydro's integrated resource plan. So we received the application at the end of last year, and sort of looking ahead to what is coming next, we set out a regulatory timetable which kind of sets out the initial milestones of the application. And the first one that I guess is of note for groups on the call here is that it's the request to become an intervener, as Patrick mentioned, what that kind of involves. If you want to be a more active participant in this proceeding, then that is coming up in March. And then what follows is a process of kind of information gathering that will build upon the information that is in BC Hydro's integrated resource plan, where the BCUC and also interveners have the opportunity to ask questions of BC Hydro based on what is in the application itself, which will help parties to gather information that they need in order to support whatever submissions they want to make in future, and from the BCUC's perspective, to gather the information it requires to make its decision. Now, after that, we have, this is by no means the end of the process, and on a sort of larger, more significant application like this, is that rather than setting out the entirety of the regulatory steps that we will follow, is that we're taking a slightly more incremental approach to take stock after we've gathered that first round of information requests. And a procedural conference is basically an opportunity for all interveners and BC Hydro to consider what they believe the next steps for the process should entail. And the scope of such procedural conferences is often set by a panel, but it may consider factors such as whether a further round of information requests required, whether there should be some kind of oral component such as a workshop that would help participants in order to participate fully for the remaining steps. It may be that interveners have evidence that they wish to file in the proceeding, or it may be that there's sufficient evidence on the record and that parties are happy to almost go to their final submissions or arguments to say, here's what we believe should be done with this application based on the evidence gathered. So I think that concludes everything that I had there, and hopefully that provided just a bit more context of what these proceedings and these applications are all about.
Thank you, Phil. Okay, so we do have some questions. The first, I guess it's just regarding how the actual process is going to be conducted. Will you be having any part of this done in person, or what's the method for conducting the actual hearing?
Sure, that's a good question. So the information request process that's set out there, that's a written process. So it would involve the filing of the questions which go away to BC Hydro to then respond to. Procedural conference, whether that's physically in person or held virtually in a setting like this, is that is something that would actually be, we'll just call it in-person component to it. And as I mentioned, that there's sort of various options for what the rest of the regulatory process could entail, and one consideration would be for whether there would be some form of oral component to the proceeding, and that for instance, it could be a workshop where BC Hydro is invited to present on a specific set of topics that perhaps require further explanation or further examination. It could be a more formal oral hearing where people from BC Hydro are put on the stand and are subject to cross-examination from interveners, sort of much the way that almost like a sort of kind of court setting, but whether the remainder of the process is held in a purely written format or otherwise will be something that is the subject of things like procedural conferences to decide.
And I would add as well that anytime we do have an oral component, we always broadcast it on our website, so anybody's always able to listen in anytime we have an oral component.
Thank you. We have a question also about whether an individual organization would have to register as an intervener to submit written comments.
Oh, go ahead, Nicola.
Oh, I was going to say, if it's a letter of comment, no, you can just file on our website the letter of comment. If you want to ask questions and be active, you need to register as an intervener. But if it's a letter of comment, that just needs to be filed.
Great. So we have a question from one of our First Nation members. And he's saying that the last IRP had several recommendations from Indigenous nations that weren't incorporated. So he's wondering, I don't know if you'll have the answer to this, but he's wondering how many nations were included in this IRP and how were they included? I think that there's some dissatisfaction with either the type or level of engagement with First Nations or the outcomes as well.
Yeah, so I can't, off the top of my head, I wouldn't necessarily know the answer to that, but what I would point in the direction of is that contained in the IRP is a documentation or a summary of all of the consultation and engagement activities that BC Hydro took place in preparation before they filed the IRP. That included a stream of consultation that took place with First Nations and Indigenous communities, and I think rather than me try and sort of estimate the number of participants that sort of took place in that, I would kind of point towards that part of the document, which does provide a summary of all of the nations that did participate, what the actual process looked like, what was said, and what BC Hydro did about it.
Okay. I guess on that same topic, we do get questions from our First Nation members as well with respect to the Commission's role in that. So, you know, there are legislated and policy commitments to First Nations reconciliation, and that includes economic reconciliation, and a number of First Nations are very interested in either increasing their participation in the renewable energy industry or initiating participation. And so are there any aspects of the current legislative and policy framework that instruct the Commission in that regard when assessing applications like this?
I think perhaps the one specific area I could at least point to where it's explicitly referenced is that in the Clean Energy Act, which is another piece of legislation that we will have to consider as part of our decision, is that there's a series of different provincial energy objectives, and I'm gonna paraphrase, I don't have it off the tip of my tongue here, but one of those objectives is fostering development in First Nation communities with clean energy, or something to that effect. So because we have to consider the applicable energy objectives, that's kind of, I guess, how it directly is referenced in terms of something that we would have to have as part of our decision making. But yeah, I think that's the only one that I think that comes to the tip of my mind.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question as well. Can you describe how the participant funding works, particularly with respect to experts?
Patrick, did you want to take that?
Yeah, sure, I can answer that. Yeah, so we have participant funding guidelines, which are available on our website, and afterwards I can always send you a link to share around with the members. There are all of the rates for the various types of experts, legal counsel, consultants. Those are all set out in an appendix to those guidelines. So there are maximum daily rates depending on years of experience and whether you're an expert or legal counsel, things like that. And there usually funding is applied for at the end of the process. But if an organization has a need or can demonstrate a need for interim funding, you can make an application for interim funding as well. and often the commission could award about 50% of the requested funding. I think, I'm not sure, is there anything else that I've missed?
I think that covers it.
Yeah, I was going to say just on the, I think it was asking about the experts as well. And experts and legal counsel are included. Typically that is for organizations rather than individuals. Typically individuals participating. We haven't seen individuals with experts, but that is definitely something that we see with organizations. And again, that's part of the PACA process of that being part of the participation. And there are opportunities as during the process where Phil was saying at procedural conferences, if there's going to be an opportunity for evidence, then that will be something that's laid there, and opportunities for interveners if the panel allows for intervener evidence, for interveners to provide expert evidence as well.
Right. Maybe I'll just add to that from Clean Energy BC's involvement. Typically there's a certain type of accreditation that we are asked to provide. So just demonstrating, you know, what that particular expert's experience and expertise is, that they're actually, you know, qualified to provide evidence that would be helpful, I think, to the process, if I have that right.
Yeah.
And then the other is we usually provide some kind of an estimate of what we think the level of effort will be early in the process. And so that I think there's a little bit of certainty then for whoever's paying the bill, you know, that they're, what type of intervention is being contemplated and what sort of level of effort and costs would be involved. Okay, so we have a question. Given that the BC government has set policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to electrify the economy, should policies result in a substantial increase in electricity demand?
I think without trying to actually give an answer to that question, all I'll say is that that certainly will be an issue to be explored in this proceeding. BC Hydro has put forward its view of what they believe policies may result in affecting electricity demand, and it's that's something for any participants within the proceeding to consider whether they agree with or otherwise.
Okay. So one question that we have that our association has been asking as well, and I know we're seeing some of this in other jurisdictions. So previously, I think IRPs were supposed to be done every 5 years. And so we're just wondering now, in this new environment where things are changing so quickly and policy is evolving, how frequently can we expect planning exercises like this to occur? I would imagine it's going to be a lot more frequently than every 5 years.
Yeah, so the panel, now that the BCUC are reviewing BC Hydro's IRP, for other utilities, we've been reviewing them for a while. The review of the BC Hydro IRP came back to the Commission over the last couple of years. It's for the panel to decide when the next one comes in. They tend not to set a frequency. It's when they direct when the next one is going to come in. And that will also be part of the process, no doubt, of during this process of something else like I'm not as familiar, and Phil may know if there's been a proposed frequency in the actual application, but that would also be subject to part of this process looking at it, and it would be for the panel to decide. 5 years, we typically see 3 to 4 in the past for other utilities. 5 is a long time, as you said, particularly in the current environment. So I would anticipate it would be shorter than that timeline.
Okay, yeah, we're seeing more frequent updates, like in Ontario and Alberta, for example.
Yeah, and in the States as well, some are coming down to 2 years as well. And in some jurisdictions now, there's a big update, and then there's intermediate updates. That's not something that we've seen in BC, but that'll all be part of the process review.
Okay, so that's good to know for us as the proceeding unfolds, that there would be some opportunity perhaps to provide some arguments on that subject, and maybe evidence on what's happening in other jurisdictions as well. Okay, we have a question about settlement sessions, for example, that are quite common in Ontario. And this is where interveners in the utility try to come to some kind of an agreement outside of the formal commission process. Is that something that happens here?
I may ask Patrick, because he has more longevity than both Phil
yeah,
and I. We have had negotiated settlement processes in the past, less so in the, actually, I don't know if that's true. Actually, we've had one in the more recent past, but we do have that ability here, but it's less common, I would say.
Yeah, it was more common probably about 10 years ago, but in the last 5 to 10 years, it has not been used in any frequency at all.
Okay. So we have another question from a First Nation member. Are there any sections pertaining to power quality and assurance? As hydro's infrastructure becomes inadequate or in need of upgrade, power quality is not stable at times, especially in Zone 2 areas that are off-grid.
So I think there may be some reference to it in the IRP, but I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to say that it is a big focus. Again, though, with putting any of that aside, is what I would say is that if there are such issues that any particular nation, group, or individual wants to raise, then whether it is in the application or not, as long as it is relevant to the scope of it, then these are the sorts of issues that can be brought to the table as a participant in it.
And I would add too, if it's not in scope of the proceeding and there are, particular issues affecting someone, they're always welcome to file a complaint with the BCUC as well. We do investigate complaints like this, or we have in the past.
Okay.
So that's another option if it's not in scope of the IRP.
Okay, I didn't realize that. Okay, thank you. So we have a question here. Canada recently committed to achieving a net zero grid by 2035. In BC Hydro's IRP, are there provisions for electricity to be generated from utility scale solar and wind farms in the province?
Both of those things are resources. What I would say, rather than commitments, is that they are resources that BC Hydro has evaluated as part of its overall process. The plan itself is not necessarily committing to any particular course of action, rather to set these are the potential pathways that it could take. But again, I would encourage that if these are specific areas of interest or focus to anyone, that these are things that they can look at and ask questions on within the application itself.
Okay, that's great. Okay, another procedural questions. Have there been successful appeals in the past?
I can't think of one.
Appeals are quite infrequent going to the Court of Appeal. We could take that question away and respond separately. I don't think any of the people attending here have that information, so we could certainly take that one away. We're more familiar with reconsiderations that have varied orders in the past, and so that certainly is the case when we have reconsidered. And it's a different, like a separate panel is appointed. So it's a new, it may sometimes be the same panel that views a reconsideration, but they're still appointed separately. It's a separate process to the proceeding, and some reconsiderations that I'm aware of have varied the original decision. Usually a reconsideration looks to change part of a decision. Again, from my experience, I haven't seen, but I've not been with the commission as long as Patrick, to completely overturn a decision as such. They tend to change part of the decision.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And if you are interested in reading some of the reconsideration decisions, I mean, they are all on our website. If you go into our orders database, you can search reconsideration, and you'll get quite a few. And there are lots in there, and there are some that do exactly that. They vary a part of a decision, or some are denied completely. And then at that point, someone could go to the Court of Appeal. But yeah, the ones that go to the Court of Appeal are quite rare.
Okay, so I think that's about all we have for questions. I'm wondering also, as we go, I'm not totally clear on what the commission does specifically in terms of engagement, you know, through something like this. Given that you're a quasi-judicial organization, I would imagine that there are a number of limitations, but can you just sort of outline for us, you know, what the nature of your stakeholder engagement is around proceedings like this?
Sorry, I was checking, I was off mute. It really does depend on the proceeding, and I think COVID has changed things an awful lot. In the past, for example, with large revenue requirements for BC Hydro, for example, we have gone around the province and done community input sessions of varying attendance, say, when we do some of these. For this IRP, we are doing this through, there aren't separate stakeholder engagement. We've been doing BCUC stakeholder engagement separately on participating in BCUC processes, reaching out to organizations to say who we are, but not on specific proceedings, because once a panel is struck, then we're in a proceeding. So community input sessions usually precede an application. And those, again, I'm going to look to Patrick on his history of, those tend to be less common. We do them in inquiries. So for example, when we did the Indigenous utility regulation inquiry, we go out and engage a lot. We engage outside of proceedings, but within proceedings, once a panel is there, then they would be in attendance to those. And in this proceeding so far, the panel has not chosen to do those, take that approach, I should say. Patrick, could you comment any further?
I don't think I have anything else to add. I mean, yeah, I think the primary ways to participate now that the proceeding is underway is by becoming an intervener or submitting a letter of comment. Those are really the two ways. And it's important to note that if you're an intervener, you can't submit a letter of comment because you're actively participating throughout the process. But any other member of the public is welcome to submit a letter of comment. And And even generally speaking, I think the commission has the ability to limit the number of letters of comment, but usually that's not an issue. You know, as the proceeding unfolds and you have more ideas that you or information that you want to share related to the application, you can file another letter of comment. So that's nothing, no problem with doing that as well. So that those are the key ways of engaging once the proceeding is started.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. Okay, so that pretty much takes up our time. I don't see any further questions, but those were good questions and really appreciate the answers that you provided. I think for us, it really helps if our industry really understands what the process entails and, you know, where we get involved and what sorts of considerations guide the process, you know, that you manage. So we really appreciate you taking the time to share this with us, and hopefully there will be opportunities again in the future to connect again and to keep our members informed on what you're doing and what the processes are.
Thank you. Thank you very much for hosting us.
Thanks so much.
Encourage, as we're saying, with regard to the IRP, we encourage people to participate. All the panel, the information needs to be provided to the panel for them to consider different perspectives. So we encourage participation.
Absolutely. Okay.
And I've left some contact information there, and I'll share these slides as well with Jack that he can distribute them. And please don't hesitate to direct your questions to me. And then if I need to find the right person to answer, I'll put you in touch with them.
That's really appreciated, Patrick. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem at all. Patrick, have a great day.
Nicolette, thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.